Hi, folks. Welcome back. I'm your professor, Professor Buenos. Here we are with Latin American philosophy again, and now we are talking about liberation philosophy, right? So let's go ahead and start up these slides. So we'll give some background introduction as always, right? We'll talk about Ignacio Ellacuría on the idea of ideology and the social function of philosophy. Um, yes, there's going to be talking a lot about what the purpose of philosophy, as well what the purpose and appearance of good philosophy is, what good philosophy looks like. We'll go ahead and look at Enrique Dussel, who's another liberation philosopher, and his idea of, and a lot of weird terms here. I'm gonna try to say them as well as I can. Analectical liberatory philosophy is, and of course the ideas of Leopold Lozère and historical consciousness. We'll conclude with some remarks on the relation between Latin America and liberation philosophy in general. Oh, so I'm not really sure why, but it's showing all the bullet points at once. Apologies. Usually I don't like it when it does that. But at its most general, liberation philosophy is a way of doing philosophy for the sake of human freedom. That is at its most general. Philosophy done for the sake of human freedom. Now, freedom is understood in a very realistic and a concrete societal, historicized, and particular manner. It's not sort of some type of metaphysical, abstract freedom. We're not really talking about some type of metaphysical free will here. Sometimes we can get a little psychological, right? Especially if there's like sort of a cultural or ideological domination going on. But that's sort of as abstract as it gets. Usually it's talking about very concrete material things. It explicitly began in Argentina in the 1960s, and it does use some European ideas, but it tries to be critical of them and doesn't accept them blindly. And it tries to adopt or be mindful of Audre Lorde's warning of using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, for instance. If you don't know who Audre Lorde is, he's a great black philosopher and great black thinker as well. And it's a little ironic, right? Because we're in a class here, and well, yeah, presumably you're in a class. That's why you're listening to this video. But it can, and I'm an academic, I'm a teacher, but it can often have some choice words for academia and professional philosophy. It does not like academia or professional philosophy. If you're a liberation philosopher, usually you would consider academic professional philosophers kind of like maybe your rivals or intention, or maybe to put at best and to put at worst, maybe you consider academic professional philosophers sellouts. Yeah, that's to put it a little worse. But let's go ahead and continue with it, right? And let's say those charges are correct or incorrect. I want to leave it up to you to um, decide that. Yeah. So here we have the first philosopher that I want to talk about, Ignacio Ellacuría, and he talks about idealization and the social function of philosophy. So again, as abstract as it's going to get, it's going to be talking about psychology and sort of believing these ideologies that makes you feel not that makes you not free. But it's never going to get so metaphysical or abstract to the point that it's talking about some metaphysical essence of free will. So, bracket your conversation of free will to the side for now. So he's a Spanish Salvadorian Jesuit philosopher, right? Ignacio. And unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1989 in El Salvador for being an outspoken critic of military dictatorship. So, he was brave, right? A criticism that they have of academic professional philosophers is essentially that we are all sort of cowards, that we keep our head down and we're not using philosophy as a form to promote freedom. He defines ideologization as a process through which a prevailing socioeconomic or political order makes itself into the only definitive and permanent mode of social organization. Basically, it's a sort of set of beliefs, and he kind of refers to it as essentially brainwashing. Um, Often it has a goal. This ideologization has some goal other than engaging in honest, good faith intellectual curiosity. Usually it has some type of material goal, and usually it results in some type of monopoly where it kind of stamps out a lot of different forms of thinking. Now, it does give example of ideologies in the United and in the Americas, Capitalism is probably the biggest one, where socialism and Marxism and communism and other forms of the market are sort of just thrown away and never considered. Patriarchy is another one. Enslavement, if you're in the 1700s. Feudalism, if you're in the Dark Ages. And I'm sure you can come up with other examples yourself. He continues, according to him, philosophy has always been about liberating us, particularly from ideology, from this brainwashing. Ideologization, sorry, I know this is hard for me to say, unconsciously and unintentionally expresses visions of reality that, rather than manifesting or revealing the reality, often hide and deform reality with the appearance of truth because of the interest of shaped by classes or social, ethnic, political, or religious groups. Now, what's interesting here is he is saying that there are facts to the world. There is a real world with real facts. And it's not just, one person believes that and one person believes this, and one person has one ideology and another person has another ideology. No, sometimes people use the term ideology in kind of like more of a neutral term as a set of beliefs. No, he has a very negative view of it. There is a reality, and ideology perverts that reality, usually for economic and material interest. So, kind of to throw this question at you, right? And make you think about it in your personal life. Choose an ideologization, as he describes it. It could be any ideologization, maybe one that I don't know. Maybe it's capitalism, racism, patriarchy, colorism, something, right? How does it hide and deform the truth? And be specific, give an example if necessary. So here's another easy example. I'll do one so you can kind of see how it works. Uh, Capitalism, you might say in capitalism, that belief in capitalism is that everyone should be entitled to the sweat of their own brow, and if you just work hard enough, you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Okay, how does that hide and deform truth? Well, it might hide and deform truth if we figure out that in our society, people who work very hard don't actually have a lot of social mobility. If we figure out that the United States or whichever country we live in actually has very low social mobility or has stagnating social mobility, and this actually is the case in the United States. Ultimately, ideologization stifles our ability to think in different ways. Of course, some people will be homeless. I think that's the thing about ideologization and capitalism with this quote. Of course, some people will be homeless. Just ignore them. Of course, eating meat is okay. Others wouldn't do if it was wrong. Well, yeah, he is sexist and old-fashioned, but what can you really do about it? He's from a different generation. This is all forms of ideologization that sort of stops us from wanting to create change and, more importantly, for liberation philosophy, trying to promote freedom. If philosophy itself does not liberate, it highly risks becoming ideologization. It highly risks stifling thought that can promote freedom. And here I have a little cute comic, right? We have some academics in the tower of books. They're telling someone down in the bottom, no, no, we just write about the world. You guys have to go out and save the bloody thing. So that's a good way of thinking how liberation philosophers would think of academic or professional philosophers. Similar to Socrates, wanting to liberate his fellow Athenians by constantly questioning them, Socrates is an example of philosophy at its best. Philosophy is at its best when it is liberation philosophy, and it is at its worst when it is ideologization and it stifles freedom. It does, not gonna lie, it does make some philosophy academic philosophers uncomfortable. Many will rather contemplate philosophical questions that they find interesting or further their academic careers than saving members of oppressed societies and, like Elacuria, putting their lives in line. Remember, Elacuria actually got assassinated because he was that outspoken, similar to Socrates. Silva tells us here, who's the author for your article, philosophizing from a position of freedom can often lead to detachment where you don't actually try to help people. When philosophy concerns only big questions that are relevant to everyday existence, it also risks becoming ideologization. Earlier in the semester, we talked about coloniality, how it's sort of the remnants of colonization, colonization being the domination of one nation economically, culturally, and politically over another, and coloniality is sort of like the remnants of that, with very obvious racial overtones. Coloniality would be considered a type of ideologization as well. Nelson Torres, Maldonado Torres, a Puerto Rican philosopher, tells us colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such a nation an empire. Coloniality is different, right? Instead, it refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but what that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration. Thus, coloniality survives after colonialism has been wiped out. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns and common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. It is maintained, coloniality, according to Torres, in our universities, in our colleges. And we can ask some uncomfortable questions, right? We're here in a college class. How much is me teaching you in a college class, you being in this college class right now, a form of coloniality? How much is it a form of ideologization? And how much should we resist that? Okay. Enrique Dussel, he's another philosopher here. I have him depicted. He basically tells us, right, that critical thought that arises from the margins of society, people who are marginalized, who don't have a lot of cultural, social, or economic stuff going for them, or not economic capital going for them, that philosophy from the periphery or from the oppressed class, the lumpen, whatever you want to call them, is usually the best form of philosophy, to put it in a nutshell. He says it always ends by directing itself towards the center. This is its death. Oh, it always ultimately ends by directing itself towards the center. This is its death as critical philosophy. It is its birth as ontology and ideology. Thought that takes refuge in the center ends by thinking to be the only reality. Outside its frontiers, it's non-being, nothing, barbarity, nonsense. Being is the very foundation of the system, the totality of the sense of a culture, the macho world of the man of the center. So, he's talking a little bit about taking some shots at patriarchy here. But he has this metaphor, right, of essentially like a circle within society or the world of knowledge. And people can encompass different parts in this circle. And the more marginal you are, the more you are treated as a low class member in society, pushed off to the sides. The more you are in the margins of the circle, the more useful things you can say to promote freedom. But these things that you say, these thoughts that you have, this, if it starts moving and becoming popular and moving towards the center and it stagnates there, then it actually has the opposite effect of making people not be free. So the periphery, can I kind of explain this, like people living in the periphery, what does it mean for philosophy to be? Well, yes, I explained these questions to you. Thus it continues. Distant thinkers, those in the margins, those who are looked down upon in society, those who don't have a lot of social and cultural capital and money, those who had a perspective of the center from the edge, from the periphery, those who had to define themselves in the presence of an already established image of the human person and in the presence of an uncivilized fellow humans, of other people who are also in the periphery. The newcomers, the ones who hope because they are always outside, these are the ones who have a clear mind for pondering reality. Those are the ones who can actually see or I'm not sure. Yes, those are the ones who can have philosophy at its best. How would they have nothing to hide? How could they hide domination if they undergo it? How would their philosophy be an ideological ontology if their practice is one of liberation from the center they are opposing? Philosophical intelligence is never so truthful, clean, and precise as when it starts from oppression and does not have to defend any privileges because it has none. So philosophy is its best when it's not at its center, when it doesn't have to defend all this social capital, this cultural capital, and this money that it has. You might want to give an example, right? Of someone who is a distant thinker, someone who is at the margins. Why were you or they distant in this situation? What do you think? What did you think, or that person think, that contributed towards freedom? Finally, here we have Leopoldo Zea and his idea of historical consciousness. Remember that according to Mexican existentialism, we are thrown into this world. We don't get to choose it in the sense we're all kind of accidents, not because maybe our parents didn't plan this, but because we didn't really choose this setting, this time and place. Those are accidents. That's up to chance. He tells us, we are created by others, by our fellow humans, a world with their religion, laws, customs, politics, economy, art, and many other forms of expression, but a world in the making of which we have not participated, a world about which no one has been consulted. Before we were born, we were not consulted on it, right? A world that never has to attend to our needs, desires, and dreams, yet nonetheless a world that we have to accept as our own, because the only other option is running away and finding no meaning in which life. Why? Well, if we do not save others from our circumstances, we do not save ourselves. As I mentioned this in the lecture on Mexican existentialism. Here are some concluding remarks. Latin American philosophy, with its emphasis on history and practicality, cannot help but be what they would call, a lot of liberation philosophers would call, philosophy born out of the struggle or struggle. Of course, not all Latin American relaxed philosophers share the commitments of liberation. Keep that in mind. Nevertheless, those who work in Latin American philosophy tradition, those who work in the Latin American philosophy tradition, often embrace their cultural, ethnic, racial, and gendered, and even national difference. Silva's conclusion here, right, is that liberation is a defining characteristic of Latin American philosophy as a whole. He tells us, in this sense, perhaps the main task of liberation philosophy remains the liberation of philosophy itself from purely academic, disengaged activity it has become. So Silva does not have a very good view of what philosophy, mainstream philosophy, has become today. And liberation philosophy, of which Latin American philosophy is essentially a form of, tries to liberate us and take us away from that. But yeah, questions, right? Is philosophy today ideologize? How can we do to sort of help liberate philosophy and in turn sort of liberate ourselves and the people around us? Okay, that's it for today, folks. I'll go ahead and see you folks next time. Take it easy.